We are living through, well, a geopolitical earthquake.
Yeah, that's honestly not an overstatement.
I mean, the map of the Middle East and really the whole architecture of global power is fundamentally fracturing right in front of us.
Right.
We are looking at the unprecedented, highly volatile military escalation that started in late February and has now led right into early March of 2026.
Bringing the U.S., Israel, and Iran into a massive direct confrontation.
Exactly. And we have an imposing stack of intelligence reports, academic papers, defense briefings sitting in front of us today.
A very tall stack.
Yeah. And we are going to map out the kinetic reality of what's happening on the ground. The thousands of physical strikes, the shifting targets, the immediate geopolitical shockwaves tearing through the region.
But before we trace the trajectory of a single missile,
Before we do that, we have to lay down a critical ground rule for this deep dive.
and setting that boundary is absolutely non-negotiable for this specific material. The documents we are analyzing today detail highly sensitive, deeply polarizing, and frankly politically charged events.
Extremely.
We are examining internal U.S. political strategies, direct statements made by President Donald Trump, the military frameworks authorized by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the rhetoric and actions of the Iranian regime.
Up to and including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
Exactly. So we must be absolutely clear with you, the listener. We are operating with strict impartiality today.
100%.
Our role is solely to report the data, trace the timelines, and analyze the strategic doctrines exactly as they are laid out in these provided sources.
We aren't taking sides here.
No. We are not endorsing any domestic or international political viewpoints, and we are not validating the moral or geopolitical claims made by any of the state actors involved.
We are simply your guides, breaking down the architecture of this conflict based entirely on the text in front of us.
That is the only way to approach this.
It is the lens we have to use, because our mission today goes way beyond the physical battlefield.
Right.
The physical destruction is historically significant, sure, but we are going to unpack the invisible war happening simultaneously in the background.
A war that these sources suggest is just as destructive as the kinetic strikes.
But infinitely more insidious. We're talking about cognitive warfare.
And while the kinetic war, the bombs, the drones, the air defense interceptors is happening thousands of miles away from most people, the cognitive war recognizes absolutely no borders.
None at all.
It is actively targeting the smartphone in your pocket. It's manipulating the underlying algorithms of your daily newsfeed.
Yeah.
It is designed to fundamentally alter your perception of reality, your trust in institutions, and your understanding of what constitutes a historical fact. You, the listener, you are the terrain in this conflict.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start by establishing the physical reality on the ground, right? Because that kinetic destruction is the foundation that this entire cognitive war is built upon.
You can't have one without the other in this scenario.
Right. So according to a comprehensive hour-by-hour briefing from the UK House of Commons Library, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated a series of massive, synchronized military strikes against Iran.
And the phrasing in the briefing is stark.
It really is. This was not a localized skirmish.
No, or a proportional response to a single event. This was a direct, systemic assault.
Aimed at dismantling Iran's leadership structure, its nuclear development sites, and its broader military infrastructure.
The sheer scale of the operation is what separates this from anything we have seen in modern history.
Yeah, the Institute for the Study of War assesses that up to the 1st of March, Israel and the U.S. had conducted roughly 2,000 individual strikes.
2,000.
Just process that number.
To put that into perspective, an operation of that magnitude requires an immensely complex choreography. You're talking intelligence gathering, airspace management, electronic warfare.
And the operations focused on 3 immediate sequential priorities, right?
Yes. First, the total suppression of Iranian air defenses to create corridors for bomber aircraft.
You have to blind them first.
Exactly. Second, degrading the physical rapacity of the Iranian military to retaliate.
Meaning the destruction of ballistic missile silos and drone launch sites.
All right. And third, disrupting their command and control networks. They specifically targeted facilities belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
But the event that fundamentally rewrites the regional equation, the thing that changes everything, is the confirmation from Iranian officials that the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes while at his office in Tehran.
The death of Ali Khamenei cannot be overstated in its impact.
I mean, he had been the supreme leader since 1989.
Succeeding the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ruhollah Khomeini.
Yeah. He wasn't just a political figurehead.
Not at all. He was the ultimate arbiter of Iranian domestic policy, foreign strategy, religious authority. His death instantly creates a staggering power vacuum.
And these 2026 strikes, which the reports note are building on previous smaller-scale actions in 2024 and 2025, they've essentially hollowed out the senior leadership of the IRGC.
And the Iranian armed forces. The army chief of staff and the defense minister were also reportedly targeted.
But the reports also highlight a massive blind spot here.
The casualties.
Right. Getting a verifiable picture of the human cost, particularly the civilian casualties resulting from 2,000 strikes, is basically impossible right now.
And the opacity of those casualty numbers is a direct result of the regime's internal security protocols.
Because the internet access within Iran has been severely throttled.
Or completely blacked out in major urban centers. When a state controls the physical infrastructure of the internet and bans international media from operating freely,
verifying the collateral damage of a massive air campaign becomes a forensic impossibility from the outside.
Exactly. The information that does leak out is fragmented. It's often unverified.
So, to understand the trajectory of the conflict, the defense briefing suggests we look to the explicit, stated objectives of the actors launching the strikes.
Because the strategic intent tells us more about the long-term geopolitical map than the immediate battle damage assessments.
So let's look at how the U.S. is defining that strategic intent. President Trump utilized Truth Social to lay out the American perspective on the escalation.
Right.
He stated that the military action was the direct, unavoidable result of the failure of diplomatic efforts that took place earlier in February 2026.
Efforts aimed at curtailing Iran's nuclear program.
Right. And his stated military objectives were uncompromising. He announced the goal was to annihilate the Iranian Navy, permanently destroy their ballistic missile sites, and fatally weaken the entire network of Iran-backed armed groups operating across the Middle East.
But he also crossed a rhetorical line there.
Yeah, he shifts this from a military containment strategy to an active regime change strategy, calling on the Iranian people to take over their government, quote, when we are finished.
And the framework he applied to that objective is what the geopolitical analysts are hyper-focused on right now.
The Venezuela model.
Exactly. In a subsequent interview, President Trump explicitly referenced what he called the Venezuela model,
which he described as a scenario where the U.S. intervened, but, quote, everybody's kept their job except for two people.
He's referring to the context of U.S. policy toward Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, where the strategy involves the capture or removal of the absolute top tier of leadership,
followed by the swapping in of a compliant successor.
Right. The strategic implication for Iran is profound. The U.S. doctrine, as stated here, aims for leadership decapitation.
The assumption is that by removing the supreme leader and the immediate inner circle, the massive entrenched bureaucracy of the Iranian state and the rank and file of the military will simply accept a new Western-friendly leadership.
To avoid total systemic collapse, he explicitly called on the IRGC to lay down their arms and peacefully merge with the, quote, Iranian patriots.
And we are seeing an almost identical strategic posture coming from the Israeli leadership.
Very much aligned.
Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz framed the operations as a necessary preemptive attack.
While Prime Minister Netanyahu reiterated that stopping the Iranian nuclear program is an existential imperative for Israel that justifies the scale of the strikes.
And Netanyahu also directed his messaging over the heads of the Iranian government, right? Speaking directly to the Iranian populace and telling them to take their destiny into their own hands.
So there is a unified public objective of regime alteration, if not total regime change, originating from both Washington and Jerusalem.
But there's a critical miscalculation here, or maybe just an accepted risk in that decapitation strategy.
The assumption that Iran would just absorb the blow.
Or collapse internally.
Yeah.
But instead, the Iranian military apparatus executed a response of unprecedented scale and geographic reach.
The scale of the Iranian retaliation fundamentally alters the regional security architecture.
Yeah.
We have to contextualize this against their historical doctrine of response.
Like 2020.
Right. When the U.S. assassinated the powerful IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani in 2020, Iran's retaliation was highly calibrated.
They launched ballistic missiles at a single U.S. military base in Iraq,
resulting in injuries, but no immediate U.S. fatalities, which allowed both sides an off-ramp.
And even following the joint U.S.-Israel strikes during the so-called 12-day war in June 2025, Iran's kinetic response was again contained.
Limited to a strike on a specific U.S. base in Qatar. It was performative as much as it was destructive.
But this March 2026 response, it discards that playbook entirely.
Completely throws it out. Iran launched hundreds of strikes, but the critical shift is the targeting.
Yeah, they didn't just target the territory of Israel or solely isolated U.S. military outposts.
They launched direct strikes against the sovereign Arab nations that host those U.S. bases.
I mean, the House of Commons report details a target list that reads like a map of the entire Gulf security infrastructure.
Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Jordan.
And these aren't just empty stretches of desert housing American troops, right?
Yeah.
The reports indicate they targeted dual-use infrastructure.
Including civilian sites like international airports within these sovereign nations.
That is a massive expansion of the theater of war.
It's a deliberate rupture of the diplomatic progress made over the last few years.
Right, because Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been actively engaged in that complex, China-brokered diplomatic rapprochement with Iran,
seeking to de-escalate regional tensions and secure their own economic visions for the future.
But by launching ballistic missiles into UAE and Bahraini airspace, Iran is effectively immolating those diplomatic bridges.
Naturally, the Gulf states have issued severe condemnations, officially accusing Iran of breaching the UN Charter by violating their territorial sovereignty.
While this isolates Tehran diplomatically from its neighbors, the strategic message Iran is broadcasting is unmistakable.
Any nation that provides basing rights, airspace, or logistical support to American forces is no longer considered a neutral bystander.
They are considered an active combatant.
And a legitimate target.
And the economic ripple effects of expanding that target list are immediate and potentially catastrophic.
Oh, absolutely.
The IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency began broadcasting explicit threats to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely.
Which is a geographical choke point where roughly 20% of the world's global petroleum and massive quantities of liquefied natural gas from Qatar flow through daily.
A closure doesn't just hurt the U.S. It threatens to spike energy prices globally.
Devastating European economies, crippling Asian manufacturing hubs that rely on Gulf oil.
And there are reports that the U.S. has already engaged and destroyed multiple Iranian naval vessels to prevent them from physically blockading the strait or laying mines.
But the mere threat of disruption causes the global markets to panic?
Right. And this widening gyre has inevitably pulled the United Kingdom directly into the kinetic exchange.
The UK's posture is categorized in the briefings as strictly defensive, but it is heavily involved due to its geographic military footprint.
Right, because the UK maintains strategic military bases across the region.
Naval facilities in Bahrain, the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, and logistical hubs in Qatar.
And UK aircraft, primarily Typhoons, have been deployed actively to intercept Iranian drones and missiles traversing the airspace over Iraq and Syria.
Furthermore, the UK Prime Minister had to address Parliament to confirm that the United States has been granted explicit permission to utilize British sovereign territory for power projection.
Which includes the use of RAF Fairford in the UK and, critically, the naval support facility at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean.
Diego Garcia is vital because it sits beyond the range of most Iranian conventional retaliatory weapons,
allowing the U.S. to launch long-range bombers with relative impunity.
The UK government stressed these permissions are for specific and limited defensive purposes to prevent Iran from targeting the wider region.
But it firmly tethers the UK to the U.S. operational framework.
It does.
Meanwhile, the global diplomatic arena is paralyzed.
The UN Secretary General issued a sweeping condemnation of all sides, criticizing the squandering of the diplomatic off-ramps that supposedly existed back in February.
But the more consequential diplomatic maneuvering is happening with the major geopolitical heavyweights, right?
China and Russia.
Both of which have spent the last decade deepening their economic integration and military cooperation with Iran.
They issued swift condemnations of the U.S. and Israeli strikes, framing them as unilateral violations of the UN Charter.
They are positioning themselves as the defenders of state sovereignty against Western aggression.
Right. Now, the physical devastation, the disrupted global markets, the shifting of military assets, all of this kinetic reality is overwhelming.
It's a lot to take in.
But the strategic documents from the National Defense University urge analysts to look at these physical events as a delivery mechanism for a secondary payload.
This is key.
Every single missile that hits an airbase, every targeted assassination of a general, every cyber attack that takes down a municipal energy grid, These actions are accompanied by a meticulously calculated psychological message.
The physical destruction achieves a military objective, sure, but it serves a parallel, maybe even primary purpose.
To manipulate the cognitive processes of the populations and the leaders watching the destruction unfold,
This is where the physical battlespace merges with the invisible battlespace.
leading us directly into the doctrine of cognitive warfare.
Before we look at how it's being deployed in this specific conflict, we need to establish a firm definition of what cognitive warfare actually is.
Because the term gets thrown around loosely.
Yeah, often confused with standard propaganda or traditional psychological operations, PSYOPS.
Like dropping leaflets over an enemy city.
Right. But the briefings from NATO's chief scientist and the Allied command transformation outline something fundamentally different.
François de Cluzel, a key figure in NATO's research, defines cognitive warfare as the purposeful degradation of an adversary's capacity to know, produce, or thwart knowledge.
It is treating the human mind itself as the ultimate domain of war.
And the distinction from traditional PSYOPS is vital. Propaganda historically aimed to convince you of a specific political truth that your side is righteous and the enemy is evil.
Right.
Cognitive warfare is significantly more ambitious. It weaponizes knowledge for a conflicting purpose. The target set has expanded beyond the military chain of command.
An adversary is no longer just targeting a physical radar installation or a tank battalion.
They are targeting the complex human cognitive and social systems that allow a society to function. They target trust networks, historical identity narratives, and the perceived legitimacy of democratic institutions.
The ultimate goal is to systematically alter how a target population processes information.
And through that manipulation, control how that population acts, or more often, fails to act.
And unlike a kinetic war that has a defined beginning and end, cognitive warfare operates continuously.
Sitting in the gray zone, just below the threshold of armed conflict.
The DEF9 Solutions Report provides a fascinating deep dive analysis of how the United States and Israel have been actively utilizing this cognitive warfare playbook against Iran for decades.
Long before the massive strikes of February 2026.
They analyze the strategy of economic warfare. Traditionally, we think of economic sanctions purely in terms of ledgers and balance sheets, right?
Starving the Iranian government of the revenue needed to fund its nuclear ambitions or its proxy networks like Hezbollah.
But the DEF9 report argues that economic sanctions are, at their foundational core, psychological weapons designed for cognitive disruption.
The mechanism of action for sanctions is economic, but the intended outcome is entirely cognitive.
When the U.S. cuts off Iran from international financial clearinghouses and sanctions their oil exports, it creates a cascading failure within the domestic Iranian economy.
It results in hyperinflation, the drastic devaluation of the Iranian rial, and crippling shortages of essential goods and medicines.
And the strategic assumption driving this policy is that as the daily friction of simply surviving becomes unbearable for the average citizen, public frustration will inevitably compound.
The cognitive intent is to force a wedge between the Iranian populace and the regime.
The underlying message the United States is transmitting to the Iranian public through these sanctions is essentially, your government's obsessive pursuit of nuclear capability and regional dominance is the direct cause of your daily suffering.
Exactly. The only way to stabilize your economy and feed your families is for your government to capitulate to international demands, or for you to dismantle the government yourselves.
It is a strategy of maximum pressure designed to expose the regime's fundamental inability to fulfill the basic social contract of providing for its citizens.
Forcing the leadership to choose between their ideological military ambitions and domestic collapse.
Israel deploys a parallel, complementary cognitive strategy, though their tactical approach has historically been more kinetic.
Israel frequently engages in surgical military strikes, highly sophisticated cyber attacks on Iranian domestic infrastructure.
Like paralyzing the nationwide gas station network.
Right, and the targeted assassinations of high-ranking nuclear scientists and IRGC officials. While these actions achieve immediate tactical degradation of Iran's capabilities, the DEF9 analysis stresses their profound cognitive effects.
When Israel repeatedly breaches Iran's highly guarded state institutions or disrupts the domestic power grid with impunity, they are intentionally manufacturing an atmosphere of internal chaos.
The cognitive objective is the systemic humiliation of the regime.
They are broadcasting a clear message to the Iranian public that their government is weak, technologically outmatched, and most importantly, deeply infiltrated by foreign intelligence.
We see this cognitive strategy clearly reflected in Israel's public messaging, too.
Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Forces have dedicated, highly active Persian-language social media channels.
They use these platforms to bypass the state media apparatus and speak directly to the Iranian people.
The rhetoric is precisely calibrated to separate the concept of the regime from the concept of the Iranian people.
They constantly highlight the oppressive, corrupt nature of the Baasid internal security militia and the financial drain of the IRGC's foreign adventures.
Juxtaposing it against the rich cultural history of the Persian people.
They are actively stoking the existing embers of domestic discontent, aiming to fan them into a localized uprising that fractures the state from within.
However, the DEF9 report poses a crucial, highly analytical question regarding this combined U.S.-Israeli strategy.
If the economic strangulation is as severe as the data indicates, and the cognitive pressure from continuous military humiliation is so high, and we already know there is immense widespread dissent within Iran.
Evidenced by the massive, sustained woman life freedom protests in recent years.
Right. Why hasn't the regime fractured? Why hasn't this decades-long cognitive strategy successfully catalyzed an internal overthrow?
The analogy the DEF9 report uses to explain this strategic failure is striking.
It's very vivid.
They suggest that trying to convince the Iranian population to rise up and overthrow a heavily armed, deeply entrenched security state simply by making them angry and poor is like trying to convince a random person to become a billionaire simply by explaining how nice it is to have money.
The motivation is demonstrably there. The desire for a different life is overwhelming.
But the practical opportunity, the mechanism, and the necessary organizational structure are entirely absent.
To understand the resilience of the regime, you have to look at the historical trauma embedded in the Iranian cognitive landscape.
The population remembers the 1979 revolution.
The overthrow of the Shah didn't lead to immediate democratic prosperity. It sparked a brutal, chaotic consolidation of power that bled into a devastating 8-year war with Iraq.
The Iranian people understand the catastrophic cost of total state collapse.
Furthermore, the regime has meticulously designed its internal security apparatus to prevent the formation of any viable alternative.
If the current government structure magically disappeared tomorrow, the only entities possessing the organizational capacity, the communication networks, and the weaponry to seize control are the hardest-line factions of the IRGC.
The broader population does not want a military dictatorship, but they are trapped because the moment a moderate, unifying opposition figure begins to gain traction, the regime's intelligence services immediately imprison, exile, or eliminate them.
So the cognitive warfare strategy of maximum pressure ultimately hits a wall of practical, physical reality.
You can manipulate perception endlessly. You can successfully make 90% of the population despise their government.
But if there is no physical mechanism, no safe organizational vehicle for that population to effect regime change, altering their perception does not translate into the desired kinetic action.
But we shouldn't view Iran merely as a passive sponge absorbing Western cognitive attacks.
Not at all. The documents show that Tehran possesses a highly sophisticated, deeply institutionalized cognitive warfare apparatus of its own.
Primarily focused on defensive narrative control.
To see how they deploy it, we need to rewind the timeline just slightly, back to the massive protests that erupted in late December 2025.
The December 2025 protests provide a perfect case study.
These demonstrations were catalyzed by sudden, severe economic hardships, specifically a spike in the cost of basic goods driven by currency fluctuations.
This is exactly the kind of domestic pressure cooker the U.S. sanctions were engineered to create.
The Iranian regime suddenly faced a dual-front crisis, a massive wave of civil unrest threatening their internal legitimacy and control, occurring precisely as the threat of external military action from the U.S. and Israel was escalating to a boiling point.
An analysis by the International Institute for Counterterrorism, the ICT, provides a granular breakdown of how the Iranian state managed this existential crisis through a highly disciplined, top-down narrative manipulation campaign.
The ICT report breaks down Iran's defensive cognitive strategy into a meticulously phased playbook.
Phase 1 was initiated almost immediately as the protests gained momentum.
On January 3, 2026, Supreme Leader Khamenei delivered a national address utilizing a tactic the analysts call partial recognition.
He didn't deny that protests were happening. Instead, he explicitly acknowledged that certain segments of the population, specifically shopkeepers and laborers, had legitimate, understandable economic grievances regarding the sudden rise in foreign currency exchange rates.
But in the exact same address, he drew a hard, unyielding line, conceptually separating these economically frustrated citizens from what he termed mercenaries and thugs who were chanting slogans against the foundation of the Islamic Republic.
That rhetorical bifurcation is a critical cognitive maneuver.
By acknowledging the economic pain of the working class, he attempts to pacify the moderate elements of the protests, signaling that the state hears their localized concerns.
But by simultaneously branding the political dissidents, those demanding systemic change, as violent mercenaries, he manufactures the cognitive and legal justification for the state security forces to deploy brutal, lethal suppression.
He is establishing a framework for the public. The state sympathizes with your financial struggles, but the individuals throwing rocks and burning buildings are not your fellow citizens. They are foreign agents attempting to destroy the country.
That rhetorical groundwork leads directly into Phase 2, the foreign agent narrative.
By January 9, Khamenei abandons any nuance regarding domestic policy failures and explicitly blames the United States and Israel for orchestrating, funding, and directing the street protests.
The state's massive media apparatus, particularly the heavily trafficked regime-aligned Telegram channels, begin a systematic campaign to characterize the protesters not as angry citizens, but as Zionist terrorists.
They escalate from rhetoric to fabricated evidence, releasing highly produced, documentary-style videos that claim to show the Israeli Mossad actively recruiting young Iranians, distributing weapons, and providing tactical training for urban warfare.
And this is where the Iranian cognitive strategy demonstrates its sophistication. They don't rely solely on denial or internal deflection.
They engage in aggressive counteraccusations, using a concept known as reflexive control.
Reflexive control is a strategy of feeding your adversary, or the global audience, a specific, tailored reality that forces them to react in a way that ultimately serves your objectives.
Often, this involves weaponizing the adversary's own internal divisions.
In that same January 9 address, Khamenei didn't just point fingers at Washington, he attacked American moral hypocrisy.
He highlighted the profound dissonance of the U.S. government, which had heavily bombed Iranian infrastructure just months prior during the June 2025 12-day war, suddenly claiming to be the righteous protectors of the Iranian people's human rights.
But the regime went further, targeting domestic American socio-political fractures.
This specific tactic is incredible to read about in the reports. While the Iranian security forces were actively suppressing protests in Tehran, the Iranian state media channels began broadcasting continuous high-definition footage of anti-ICE protests, immigration and customs enforcement protests that were concurrently happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
The Iranian foreign minister took to X, formerly Twitter, and directly accused the United States of grotesque hypocrisy.
He argued that the U.S. had no standing to condemn Tehran's crowd control methods while simultaneously ignoring or covering up the shooting of a protester by ICE agents in the American Midwest.
The message they were transmitting to their own citizens and to the global South was clear. Look at the United States. They cannot even maintain order in their own cities without resorting to state violence. Why are we allowing them to lecture us on morality?
That tactic is designed to neutralize the adversary's moral authority on the global stage, making it harder for the U.S. to build a coalition of condemnation.
Once that moral equivalency is established in the information space, the regime moves to Phase 3. The victory narrative.
Around January 12, as the physical crackdowns intensified behind the scenes, the state organized massive, compulsory pro-government rallies across the country.
They flooded the domestic airwaves and international social media platforms with endless imagery of hundreds of thousands of citizens marching in unison, waving the flag of the Islamic Republic.
The cognitive objective here is to project an aura of absolute, unshakable national unity and regime durability.
They are essentially manufacturing a visual consensus of total state control to obscure the reality of the localized internet blackouts and the violent, targeted arrests happening in the neighborhoods the cameras aren't allowed into.
Finally, we reach Phase 4, the ongoing war. On January 17th, Khamenei delivered a capstone speech where he directly, personally blamed Donald Trump for the casualties resulting from the protest crackdowns.
He executed a masterful reframing of the narrative. He took a localized crisis born of domestic economic mismanagement and redefined it as an acute national security emergency, characterizing the civil unrest as a direct, chronological extension of the June 2025 12-day war.
The message to the populace was unambiguous. We're not managing a domestic dispute. We are under active, hybrid siege by American imperialism. You must subordinate your economic grievances and stand unconditionally with the state, because our collective survival is at stake.
Crucially, this tightly controlled top-down narrative wasn't contained within the geographic borders of Iran.
It was systematically exported and amplified across the Middle East by a network of proxy forces.
The Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the ISD, conducted a deep analysis of how Iran's various allied militias, the Axis of Resistance, responded to Tehran's narrative directives.
Because the messaging is so heavily centralized in Tehran, the proxy groups were obligated to echo the core narrative. But the variations in how they amplified it reveal significant underlying geopolitical realities about the coalition.
The disparities in the proxy responses are incredibly revealing.
Look at Kataib Hezbollah, the heavily Iran-backed Shia militia operating in Iraq. Their leadership didn't just echo the narrative, they escalated it militarily.
They explicitly warned the United States against any intervention in Iran's internal affairs, threatening to ignite a full-scale war across Iraq to defend the Islamic Republic.
You see a similarly aggressive posture from the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthi leadership broadcast televised speeches reinforcing the Iranian claim that the U.S. was utilizing criminal gangs to destabilize Tehran. And they backed that up with renewed threats to strike U.S. naval vessels operating in the Red Sea.
But then compare that to the response from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is arguably Iran's most capable and strategically vital proxy.
Officially, their leadership echoed the mandated narrative, blaming U.S. economic sanctions for the inflation and foreign intelligence agents for the violence.
However, their senior leadership conspicuously avoided issuing the kind of explicit, immediate military threats seen from the Iraqi militias, stating merely that any decision to intervene militarily would be made in due course.
They maintained a deliberate strategic ambiguity.
However, in the unofficial sphere, pro-Hezbollah Telegram channels adopted a much more aggressive, modern cognitive warfare tactic.
Rather than issuing traditional written threats, they began flooding social media with highly realistic, AI-generated images depicting U.S. military bases across the Middle East engulfed in flames, implicitly threatening the total eradication of the American footprint in the region.
And the most glaring anomaly in the ISD report regarding the proxy network is Hamas.
The analysis notes that Hamas maintained an almost total, deafening silence regarding the Iranian protests.
Within pro-Hamas digital channels, the limited discussion that did occur mostly defaulted to framing the protests as a generic U.S.-Israeli intelligence operation.
Or they voiced a pragmatic concern that if the Iranian regime actually collapsed, it would be a catastrophic strategic loss for the Palestinian cause, as it would allow the U.S. and Israel to permanently reshape the balance of power in the Middle East.
Why the silence? It points to a profound fracture line within this alliance.
Hamas is a Sunni organization fighting a highly localized, geographically confined war in Gaza. While they have historically relied on Tehran for funding and munitions, they exist somewhat apart from the core Shia ideology of the Axis.
They likely calculated that actively defending the violent suppression of Iranian citizens by a Shia regime would severely alienate their potential Sunni Arab backers in Egypt, Jordan, and the broader Gulf.
It highlights that even within a supposed unified front, varying degrees of vulnerability dictate their participation in the cognitive war.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ISD report shows how this narrative amplification transcends the Middle East.
We saw the rapid activation of what analysts refer to as global echo chambers.
The informal but increasingly aligned CRINC alliance, comprising China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, function as a massive synchronized geopolitical megaphone.
Russia's state-linked media apparatus, particularly the RT network broadcasting in multiple languages, aggressively pushed the foreign-backed riots narrative.
The Russian representative to the United Nations took it a step further, officially claiming in the Security Council that the Iranian protests were a textbook example of Western color revolution tactics, attempting to legitimize Iran's crackdown by comparing it to historical events in Ukraine or Georgia.
China, meanwhile, utilized the crisis to reinforce its own overarching strategic narrative, presenting the United States as the primary vector of global instability, amplifying the Iranian comparisons to the Minneapolis protests to mock U.S. diplomatic condemnations.
The most unsettling aspect of this global amplification is how the Iranian state propaganda seamlessly bled into domestic Western political discourse.
The ISD monitors tracked how both far-right and far-left social media ecosystems in the West interacted with the crisis.
On the far right, you had prominent digital figures pushing conspiracy theories that the casualty numbers in Iran were a fabricated Jewish psyop engineered by Israel to drag the American military into another endless Middle Eastern war.
Conversely, in far-left digital spaces, accounts were reflexively blaming U.S. economic imperialism and covert Israeli manipulation for the entirety of the unrest, absolving the Iranian regime of its agency.
The terrifying reality is that both extremes of the Western political spectrum were wittingly, or perhaps entirely unwittingly, acting as amplifiers for the exact narrative frameworks meticulously designed by the IRGC in Tehran.
This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the core, underlying mechanism of modern cognitive warfare. The most effective campaigns do not require the intelligence agency to invent a complex lie entirely from scratch.
The strategy is far more efficient. You identify the pre-existing, deeply entrenched socio-political fault lines within your adversary's society in this case. The extreme political polarization, institutional distrust, and algorithmic siloing within Western democracies.
You inject a narrative that aligns with the existing grievances of those polarized groups, and then you simply let the platform's engagement algorithms and the organic echo chambers do the heavy lifting of distribution and radicalization.
And that brings us to the technological paradigm shift that has fundamentally accelerated and automated this entire process.
This is the pivot point in our deep dive. Up until now, we've been examining cognitive warfare through the lens of human agency leaders giving speeches, intelligence officers drafting propaganda, populations reacting to economic pressure.
But a deeply concerning report from the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, BSI, reveals that by the year 2025, artificial intelligence had crossed a critical threshold of weaponization.
They highlighted a statistic that fundamentally alters how we must view the information space.
By 2025, over 50% of all content generated on the internet was created by AI, and automated bot traffic had officially surpassed human activity, reaching 51%.
The digital infrastructure we rely on to perceive reality is now, statistically speaking, more machine than human.
We have to pause and genuinely consider the implications of that data point. The absolute majority of the information ecosystem that voters, journalists, and policymakers rely on to synthesize their understanding of the world is synthetic.
State adversaries recognize that this fundamentally changes the rules of engagement. They no longer need to execute labor-intensive campaigns to convince individual human users on Twitter or Facebook.
Instead, they can achieve a much broader, more permanent strategic victory by poisoning the well of truth itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The BC report details the operational shift of the Russian-linked Pravda network.
Historically, these troll farms operated by publishing millions of low-quality propaganda articles that very few actual humans ever read, hoping to manipulate search engine rankings.
But their new target isn't human readership. Their target is the automated web crawlers that scrape the internet to harvest the massive datasets required to train large language models.
The technical term for this strategy is LLM data poisoning, and it is a brilliant exploitation of a structural vulnerability in AI development.
The Pravda network systematically flooded the internet with millions of articles that subtly laundered Russian state media narratives, embedding them within seemingly innocuous news sites or historical archives.
Because developing a competitive AI model requires ingesting incomprehensible petabyte-scale amounts of data, the tech companies developing these models simply deploy web crawlers to scrape everything available.
They do not possess the computational or human resources to verify the factual credibility or the political bias of every single article at that scale.
The AI simply ingests the poisonous fact.
And the strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. The BII researchers found that by March 2025, fully 33% of the responses generated by major, publicly available chatbots concerning the Ukraine conflict or Middle Eastern geopolitics contained distinct traces of Pravda-originated narratives.
The societal impact is a systematic, invisible erosion of our epistemic foundations.
When a citizen queries an AI chatbot, a system they have been conditioned to trust as a neutral, objective, highly advanced synthesizer of global information, and that chatbot outputs state-sponsored Russian or Iranian propaganda disguised as objective fact, the user is compromised without ever knowing they were targeted.
The damage compounds exponentially. That contaminated AI output is frequently copy-pasted and published back onto the internet by users, bloggers, or automated news aggregators.
It then becomes part of the digital record, waiting to be scraped as training data for the next generation of AI models.
It creates an inescapable self-reinforcing cycle of informational contamination, where the concept of a baseline truth is slowly deleted from the system.
It functions exactly like a replicating virus within the world's digital nervous system. And the attacks are evolving from broad, generalized propaganda to hyper-personalized psychological manipulation.
The BIAC report outlines the capabilities of a Chinese-developed system known as Galaxy.
This wasn't a tool designed to blast generic pro-Beijing messaging to the masses. The Galaxy system utilized advanced web scraping to build intricately detailed psychological profiles on thousands of targets, specifically U.S. lawmakers, their staff, and high-impact digital influencers.
It analyzed their public statements, voting records, social media interactions, and open-source financial data. They moved from mass broadcasting to precision-guided influence operations.
The Galaxy system highlights a permanent, structural vulnerability inherent in democratic societies when fighting a cognitive war.
Our political systems are fundamentally built on the architecture of transparency, publicly accessible voting records, open financial disclosures, media pluralism, and unrestricted social media platforms.
Authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, and Iran actively weaponize this transparency. They harvest our massive open datasets to train their AI models to generate highly personalized, psychologically resonant content tailored specifically to the insecurities, biases, and vulnerabilities of specific American officials or voter blocs.
Conversely, authoritarian states operate behind severe digital firewalls. They restrict access to their domestic data, closely monitor their citizens' digital footprints, and ban Western platforms, making reciprocal, precision-targeted profiling by Western intelligence agencies nearly impossible.
It is a profound asymmetric disadvantage.
And we are seeing this asymmetric warfare play out not just in long-term political profiling, but in the rapid chaos of active military conflicts.
During the June 2025 12-day war between Iran and Israel, the world witnessed the absolute normalization of synthetic media deployed as tactical weaponry. Both sides were deploying deepfakes within hours, sometimes minutes, of actual kinetic strikes.
The BIAC report documents how AI-generated videos depicting completely fabricated missile impacts on downtown Tel Aviv, or photorealistic images of downed advanced Israeli F-35 fighter jets, were generated and disseminated across social platforms in 5 different languages almost instantaneously.
The Israelis matched this capability with an operation labeled Prison Break, where they deployed highly sophisticated deepfake content targeting Iranian command structures within 1 hour of executing real-world airstrikes.
The critical takeaway here is that even technologically advanced democratic states now view AI-enabled psychological operations as essential standard-issue military tools deployed alongside kinetic munitions.
The rapid mimification of warfare, combined with the overwhelming flood of what digital researchers term AI slop, has completely collapsed the traditional boundary between information warfare and kinetic combat.
They are now singular, integrated operations.
A report from the Atlantic Council perfectly illustrates the paralyzing effect this has on civilian understanding. They analyzed the events in early 2026 surrounding U.S. involvement in Venezuela.
The digital space was immediately overwhelmed by massive quantities of AI-generated media content regarding the intervention.
Some of it was easily identifiable as political satire, some of it was hyper-realistic and deeply serious. But the cumulative effect was to intentionally blur the line between reality and synthetic manipulation.
If civilians, human rights observers, and even professional journalists cannot trust the visual evidence provided by their own eyes, how is a society supposed to debate, understand, or report on a war?
The grim reality is that they cannot. The society becomes cognitively paralyzed.
But the implications extend far beyond civilian confusion. This cognitive noise is actively engineered to target the military chain of command.
A highly theoretical but deeply concerning paper from the Military Intelligence Professional Bulletin, the MIPB, explores the cascading failures that occur when adversarial noise is successfully injected into the specialized data corpora used by modern militaries.
As the sheer volume of battlefield data grows exponentially, senior military decision-makers and frontline commanders are increasingly reliant on military-specific AI tools.
The MIPB uses a theoretical model they call CambaGPT, an AI system used for everything from rapidly drafting intelligence summaries from drone feeds to devising logistical strategies in real time.
The vulnerability lies in the training data. If an adversary, say a Russian cyber unit, utilizes botnets to subtly inject adversarial noise, imperceptible alterations to data points into the massive feeds that Gamma GPT trains on, it induces what computer scientists call AI hallucinations.
The military AI begins producing outputs that sound incredibly coherent, logical, and authoritative, but are entirely false or strategically misleading.
It might confidently misidentify an allied convoy as an enemy formation or invent a non-existent SAM site.
The MIPB stresses that when this happens, it profoundly disrupts the military chain of command. If a commander realizes the AI tools they rely on for survival are generating fabricated intelligence, it degrades organizational trust.
It breeds deep skepticism toward higher headquarters that mandated the use of the tools, and it shatters the shared operational picture required to execute complex maneuvers.
The psychological end state of this sustained data poisoning is a condition known as epistemic learned helplessness.
This occurs when soldiers in a combat zone or civilians trying to navigate an election face such an unrelenting, high-volume barrage of synthetic media, hyper-realistic deepfakes, conflicting narratives, and AI hallucinations that they simply abandon the cognitive effort required to determine what is true.
The mental burden of constantly interrogating every piece of media, questioning every intelligence briefing, and verifying every chatbot response becomes so exhausting that the human mind simply shuts down its critical faculties as a defense mechanism.
Individuals retreat into highly insular, ideological echo chambers where their biases are confirmed, and the shared objective understanding of reality necessary for a functioning military unit or a functioning democracy simply evaporates.
That concept, epistemic learned helplessness, is genuinely terrifying, and it perfectly contextualizes why NATO's highest scientific bodies are ringing the alarm bells so aggressively.
A detailed article analyzing the NATO 2026 Chief Scientist Report makes a definitive doctrinal declaration. Cognitive warfare is no longer an abstract theory. It is a recognized, distinct, and highly active operational domain of conflict, equal in importance to land, sea, air, space, and cyber.
Dr. James Giordano, a leading voice in these NATO studies, stresses that military planners must stop viewing this merely as modernized public relations or upgraded PSYOPS.
The target set has fundamentally shifted. Adversaries are no longer just targeting discrete political opinions. They are attempting to hack the human cognitive and social operating systems.
Dr. Giordano provides a meticulous, chilling breakdown of how adversaries execute these attacks across three distinct interconnected levels of the human experience.
The foundation is the biological level. This does not necessarily mean biological weapons in the traditional sense. It means targeting the nervous system itself, the physical neurochemical substrate of human thought.
While this can involve theoretical neurotechnologies, it more commonly involves the deliberate, algorithmically optimized induction of chronic stress, fear, outrage, and heightened arousal states via relentless digital stimuli.
The goal is to keep the target population in a constant state of neurological fight or flight, which scientifically degrades the prefrontal cortex's capacity for complex, rational analysis.
Once you have degraded the biological hardware, you move to the psychological level.
This is where adversaries manipulate how the individual interprets the world around them. It involves utilizing AI-enabled influence operations to relentlessly exploit known cognitive biases like confirmation bias or the availability heuristic.
It involves framing geopolitical events using highly emotional triggers and deploying hyper-personalized content designed to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities or historical traumas of a targeted population segment.
And all of this serves the ultimate objective, which resides at the social level.
Precisely. The social level is the strategic endgame. This involves fracturing the group cohesion that allows a society to function.
It involves the systematic weaponization of historical grievances, the deliberate exacerbation of identity politics, and the mass cultivation of the epistemic chaos we just analyzed.
The ultimate goal of a sophisticated cognitive attack at the social level isn't necessarily to convince a population to believe a specific fabricated lie. The goal is to make them doubt the very existence of objective truth.
If a society cannot agree on basic facts, they cannot form a consensus on how to govern themselves, thereby destroying the legitimacy and the functionality of their institutions without firing a single kinetic shot.
To truly grasp the military devastation this causes, we have to view it through the lens of a foundational strategic concept, the OD loop: observe, orient, decide, act.
It is the core framework for decision-making in any competitive environment. To win a dogfight or a global war, you must cycle through your OD loop faster and more accurately than your adversary.
Think of it like driving a car. You observe a hazard in the road, you orient yourself to the speed and distance, you decide to swerve, and you act by turning the wheel. If you do it fast enough, you survive.
And cognitive warfare is engineered to function as a catastrophic virus, explicitly targeting the orient phase of that loop.
Let's stick with the car analogy. Cognitive warfare isn't putting a roadblock in your way, it's someone remotely hacking your windshield display, so it projects an image of an empty road when there is actually a brick wall ahead.
Your observation phase is fundamentally corrupted by poisoned AI intelligence. Because your data is flawed, you cannot accurately orient to the true nature of the threat.
If a military commander cannot orient to reality, they cannot decide on a course of action. They become paralyzed by uncertainty and contradictory data.
The ODA loop shatters, and the ability to execute kinetic military operations effectively, let alone decisively, collapses.
Because the inescapable reality of 21st century conflict is that whoever controls the cognitive battlespace ultimately dictates the outcome of the kinetic battlespace.
This realization is driving the massive geopolitical realignments we're seeing globally. It explains why the Atlantic Council predicts that the remainder of 2026 and the coming decade will be defined by the battle of the AI stacks.
The utopian vision of a unified global internet is dead. The world is rapidly fracturing as the United States, China, and the European Union aggressively push to develop sovereign AI.
That fracturing is driven by the stark realization that a nation can no longer trust foreign-owned digital public infrastructure to remain neutral. A sovereign state must assert total control over its entire AI ecosystem.
That means controlling the physical hardware, the massive energy-intensive data centers, the advanced microchips, the global cloud storage networks, as well as the foundational software models that process the data.
This is why the U.S. government launched the Stargate initiative, proposing an unprecedented multi-hundred-billion-dollar investment to build domestic AI infrastructure, while China simultaneously doubles down on insulating its domestic models and dominating open-source development in the global south.
They understand that AI is the indispensable engine of cognitive warfare. If a military or a society relies on an adversary's AI stack to process its reality, it has effectively surrendered its cognitive sovereignty.
We have covered an immense, complex landscape today. Let's try to synthesize the key takeaways.
We began by analyzing the physical kinetic reality, the unprecedented barrage of missile strikes, drone attacks, and assassinations echoing across the Middle East in late February and early March of 2026.
We've examined the explicit strategies of the United States and Israel as they attempt a high-risk decapitation of the Iranian regime and the permanent neutralization of its nuclear capabilities.
We've tracked Iran's massive, paradigm-shifting retaliation, striking sovereign Arab nations, threatening the global energy arteries in the Strait of Hormuz, and attempting to impose an unacceptable cost on the American military presence.
But running parallel to and deeply intertwining with that physical destruction, we've mapped the invisible, pervasive architecture of cognitive warfare.
We've analyzed how the U.S. and Israel leverage decades of economic sanctions and targeted kinetic strikes not merely to destroy physical assets, but to systematically humiliate the regime and apply unbearable psychological pressure on the Iranian populace.
We've dissected the sophisticated, multi-phase defensive narratives woven by Iran's leadership, blaming foreign intelligence, weaponizing Western hypocrisy, and reframing domestic economic protests as an existential war for national survival.
And perhaps most importantly, we've explored how this entire geopolitical chessboard has been fundamentally altered and rendered infinitely more dangerous by the integration of artificial intelligence.
We've moved from the Russian Pravda network quietly poisoning the training data of global chatbots, to the Chinese Galaxy system executing precision-targeted psychological profiling on democratic leaders, to the terrifying reality of military AI hallucinations paralyzing the OD loop of decision-makers.
So after all this analysis, what does this actually mean for you, the listener?
It means that the historical geographic boundaries of war have been permanently erased. You, sitting in your home, scrolling through your social media feed, reading an aggregated news article, or asking a chatbot to summarize a complex topic, you are the ultimate terrain in this new paradigm of conflict.
Every viral video you consume, every politically charged comment you engage with, and every AI-generated response you implicitly trust represents an active, contested front line.
Sophisticated state actors, utilizing immense computational power, are spending billions of dollars to bypass your critical thinking, access your nervous system, manipulate your personal OD loop, and ultimately weaponize your identity against the very society you live in.
It is a massive, incredibly heavy reality to process. But as always, we promise to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to deeply consider long after the audio stops on this deep dive.
Consider the long-term trajectory of the data poisoning we discussed. We know that current AI models are systematically ingesting adversarial noise, vast oceans of synthetic propaganda, deepfakes, and manipulated data designed specifically to deceive.
We also know that the outputs of these compromised models are being published online, subsequently becoming the foundational training data for the next, more powerful generation of AI systems.
We are currently building the digital infrastructure that will serve as the historical record and the real-time intelligence apparatus for the future of humanity on these corrupted models.
If this self-reinforcing cycle of contamination continues unchecked, how will the next generation, or even a historian 50 years from now, even begin to define what constitutes historical fact?
If the sum total of human knowledge is permanently, invisibly poisoned by synthetic geopolitical warfare, the ultimate casualty of the next global conflict might not be a specific nation, a military alliance, or a regime.
The ultimate casualty might simply be the very concept of objective reality itself.
That is a chilling, profound thought to end on, but it perfectly underscores exactly why we need to keep digging into these documents, keep questioning our sources, and keep our minds as sharp as possible.
The terrain of reality is shifting, and paying attention is the only defense we have. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and we will catch you on the next one.